You're not the kind of CEO we expected." The words didn't echo, they landed, sharp and deliberate, like a decision already made before she ever walked through the door. The room didn't move, but something inside it shifted. A $900 million deal sat on the table, printed in thick binders, lined with tabs and signatures waiting to happen, and yet all anyone could see was her. Ava Jackson stood at the far end of the conference room, framed by glass walls that looked out over downtown Manhattan, the skyline glowing under a pale afternoon sun. No designer labels. No diamond watch. Just a tailored navy blazer, a quiet presence, and eyes that didn't ask for permission. Around the table sat the Whitmore family, 3 generations of old money stitched into posture and tone, their name printed on half the buildings within view, their reputation built on acquisitions that never went wrong, until now. Richard Whitmore, the patriarch, leaned back in his chair with a smile that never quite reached his eyes, his cufflinks catching the light as he folded his hands. "We were expecting someone a bit more seasoned," he added, his voice smooth, almost polite, but edged with something colder beneath. A faint chuckle followed from his son, Daniel, seated to his right, who didn't bother to hide the way his gaze swept over Ava like she was an anomaly in a room built for certainty. Across from them, legal teams sat still, pens hovering, assistants frozen mid-note, the quiet tension stretching tighter with every second that passed. Ava didn't respond. She didn't correct them. She didn't introduce herself again. She simply walked forward, each step measured, heels soft against the polished floor, until she reached the chair at the head of the table, the one no one had offered her. For a moment, no one spoke. The air felt heavier, like the room itself was holding its breath. Then Margaret Whitmore, seated at the far end, adjusted her glasses and glanced down at the deal summary before looking back up with a thin smile. "This is a very complex transaction," she said, her tone laced with quiet dismissal. "We just want to be sure everyone involved fully understands what's at stake." A pause. Just long enough to make the implication settle. Ava placed her folder on the table, her fingers resting lightly on the edge, steady, unhurried. She had seen this before. Not this room. Not these faces. But this moment, the assumption, the doubt, the quiet rewriting of who she was before she had even spoken a word. At 24, it was a venture capitalist who told her she lacked presence. At 31, it was a board member who asked if she was the assistant. Now, decades later, billions in assets under her leadership, and still, this. Across the table, a junior associate shifted in his seat, glancing between the Whitmores and Ava, something uneasy flickering across his face, like he was watching a line being crossed in real time. Daniel Whitmore leaned forward, tapping the edge of the contract with a pen. "Let's be honest," he said, his voice louder now, filling the room with a confidence that felt rehearsed. "Deals at this level require a certain image. Investors expect it." The word image lingered, heavy, intentional. A few heads nodded. No one challenged it. Ava finally pulled out her chair and sat down, smooth and controlled, her gaze lifting to meet his without hesitation. She didn't smile. She didn't argue. She just looked at him, long enough for the silence to stretch, long enough for the weight of it to press against every person in that room. And still, they mistook it for weakness. They mistook it for hesitation. They had no idea they were already being measured. No one reached for the contract. Not yet. The room stayed suspended in that fragile space between assumption and consequence, where confidence often disguises itself as control. Ava Jackson rested her hands lightly on the table, her fingers still, her posture effortless, as if the weight of $900 million was just another number on a page she had already memorized. Across from her, Richard Whitmore shifted slightly in his chair, his expression tightening for a fraction of a second before smoothing back into practiced authority. He was not used to silence that did not bend. "Let us proceed," he said, gesturing toward the stack of documents as if reclaiming the rhythm of the room. Pens moved again. Pages turned. But the energy had changed. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. Daniel Whitmore leaned forward once more, sliding a revised sheet across the table toward Ava without asking, his tone casual in a way that felt rehearsed. We made a few adjustments, he said. Nothing major. Just standard. Protections on our side. The word standard carried a quiet arrogance, as if the terms of power were already agreed upon before the conversation had even begun. Ava glanced down at the page. Her eyes moved quickly, precise, absorbing every clause, every line, every quiet shift in control hidden behind polished legal language. A reduction in decision authority. A reallocation of equity. A clause that placed final approval in the hands of the Whitmore family board. Small changes. Strategic changes. The kind that only mattered if you understood what you were looking at. And she did. Across the table, Margaret Whitmore watched her closely, her fingers steepled beneath her chin, studying not the document but the woman reading it. These are necessary adjustments, Margaret added, her voice calm, almost instructional. At this level, partnerships require trust. Structure ensures that trust is maintained. Another pause. Another implication. The junior associate from earlier shifted again, his pen tapping lightly against his notebook before he caught himself, the sound too loud in a room this controlled. He glanced at Ava, then quickly away, as if unsure whether he was witnessing negotiation or something else entirely. Ava closed the folder slowly. Not a snap. Not a signal. Just a quiet, deliberate motion that drew every eye back to her without her asking for attention. She lifted her gaze, meeting Richard first, then Daniel, then Margaret, one by one, as if cataloguing them. Still, she did not speak. Daniel exhaled a short laugh under his breath, leaning back in his chair with a confidence that felt increasingly forced. Look, he said, spreading his hand slightly, this is how deals like this get done. We bring legacy. You bring growth. It is a balance. The hesitation before the last word did not go unnoticed. It never did. Ava tilted her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the statement without validating it. Her voice, when it finally came, was calm, even, almost soft. A balance, she repeated. Not a question. Not an agreement. Just an echo that made the word sound different the second time. The room stilled again. Outside, the city moved as it always did, cars flowing through intersections, people crossing streets, unaware that inside this glass-walled room, something far more controlled was beginning to fracture. Richard leaned forward now, his patience thinning at the edges. If there is an issue, he said, his tone sharpening just enough to reveal it, we can address it. But we will need clarity. Ava held his gaze, unblinking, her expression unchanged. Clarity is exactly what I am waiting for, she said. And in that moment, something subtle but undeniable shifted again. Not in her. In them. Because for the first time since she walked into the room, the Whitmores were no longer entirely certain they were the ones in control. The silence did not break this time. It stretched, thin and deliberate, like a wire pulled too tight across the room, and everyone felt it. Ava Jackson did not move. She did not reach for the contract again. She simply sat there, composed, as if time itself had slowed to match her pace. Across the table, Daniel Whitmore shifted in his chair, the confidence he had worn so easily now beginning to crack at the edges. He glanced toward his father, then back at Ava, as if waiting for someone else to restore the script he thought they were following. Let us not overcomplicate this, Daniel said, his voice sharper now, less polished. We are offering access to networks that have taken decades to build. That has value. Ava's eyes did not leave his. I am aware of the value, she replied, her tone steady, almost quiet. No emotion. No challenge. Just a statement that landed heavier than anything raised. Margaret Whitmore leaned forward slightly, her fingers pressing flat against the table as if grounding herself in something solid. Then you understand why these adjustments are necessary, she said. We protect what we have built. Ava gave a small nod. Not agreement. Recognition. You protect control, she said. The word settled differently than the ones before it. Control. It did not sound like strategy. It sounded like exposure. A few heads turned. The junior associate looked up again, this time not hiding it, his eyes moving between the Whitmores as if waiting to see how they would respond. Richard Whitmore's expression hardened, the polite distance gone now, replaced with something more direct. "Control is not a negative word in our world," he said. "It is the reason we are sitting here." Ava leaned back slightly in her chair, the movement slow, measured, her gaze never wavering. "No," she said, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. "It is the reason you think you are." The shift was immediate. Not loud. Not dramatic. But undeniable. The room felt smaller. Tighter. Like the walls had moved in just enough to make everyone aware of it. Daniel let out a short breath, this time not a laugh but something closer to frustration. "You are reading too much into this," he said, tapping the contract again, though the motion lacked its earlier confidence. "This is standard practice at this level. You cannot expect us to hand over influence without safeguards." Ava's gaze dropped briefly to the document, then returned to him. "And you cannot expect me to give it away," she said. Across the table, one of the Whitmore legal advisors cleared his throat softly, flipping through his copy of the agreement, his brow tightening as if seeing something for the first time. He did not speak. Not yet. But the hesitation was there. Ava noticed. She always did. Outside the glass walls, the light had shifted slightly, the sun lower now, casting longer reflections across the table, stretching shadows that seemed to mirror the tension inside the room. Margaret adjusted her posture again, her composure still intact but thinner now, like a surface under pressure. "We are trying to build a partnership," she said. Ava's expression did not change. "No," she replied. "You are trying to redefine one." The words did not rise. They did not need to. They landed exactly where they were meant to. And for the first time since the meeting began, no one on the other side of the table spoke immediately. Because somewhere beneath the structure, beneath the contracts and the language and the assumptions, something had shifted into focus. And it was not in their favor. The room did not recover. It adjusted. Slowly. Carefully. Like something trying to hide a fracture without admitting it was there. Richard Whitmore leaned back again, but this time the movement felt deliberate, calculated, as if he was repositioning himself inside a situation that no longer followed his expectations. His fingers tapped once against the armrest, a small sound that echoed louder than it should have in a room this controlled. "You are confident," he said, his voice quieter now, less performative, more precise. Ava Jackson did not react to the observation. She had heard it before, framed as admiration, as criticism, as warning. It always meant the same thing. Daniel Whitmore exhaled and leaned forward again, this time with a sharper edge, the restraint thinning. "Confidence is not the issue," he said. "Alignment is." He slid another page across the table, this one marked with annotations, red ink cutting through sections like quiet corrections. "We need leadership that reflects the scale of this partnership. Someone who can represent it properly in the rooms that matter." The word properly lingered. It did not need explanation. It carried its own weight. Ava's eyes moved to the page, then back to him, her expression unchanged, but something in her gaze sharpened, almost imperceptibly. Across the table, Margaret Whitmore did not interrupt. She watched. Always watching. Measuring not just what was said, but how it was received. The junior associate shifted again, his discomfort no longer subtle, his pen still in his hand but forgotten, his attention fixed entirely on the exchange unfolding in front of him. Ava placed her hand lightly on the edge of the contract, not to claim it, not to accept it, but to anchor the moment. "Say it clearly," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was no softness left in it. Daniel blinked once, caught off guard by the directness. "I believe I just did," he replied, a faint smile returning, though it did not reach his eyes. Ava held his gaze. "No," she said. "You suggested it." A pause. The kind that forces truth into the open. The room tightened again. Richard's eyes flicked briefly toward his son, then back to Ava, his jaw setting just enough to show the shift. Daniel straightened slightly, the performance dropping for a moment, replaced by something more honest, more revealing. "Fine," he said. "We are not convinced you are the right face for this deal." There it was. Not hidden. Not polished. Just spoken. The words settled over the table like a verdict they thought they had the authority to deliver. No one spoke. Not the lawyers. Not the assistants. Not even Margaret. Because now it was clear. Ava did not move. She did not react. But the silence around her changed. It was no longer passive. It was deliberate. Controlled. She had heard variations of this her entire life. Different rooms. Different voices. Same conclusion. At 25, it came with a polite rejection letter. At 30, it came with a delayed approval that never arrived. Now it came dressed in $900 million and a seat at a table they believed she had been invited to. Ava slowly withdrew her hand from the contract and folded it over the other, her posture straight, her presence unwavering. "The right face," she repeated, her tone even, almost reflective, as if testing the phrase for accuracy. Then she looked at each of them again, one by one, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain. And for the first time, the Whitmores did not look like they were evaluating her. They looked like they were waiting. And they did not realize they had already said too much. No one interrupted her this time. Not after those words settled into the room like something irreversible. Ava Jackson remained still, her hands folded lightly in front of her, her posture composed, but the air around her felt different now, sharper, like the edge of something that had been waiting to surface. Across the table, Daniel Whitmore leaned back again, but the confidence he tried to reclaim did not fully return. It lingered, uneven, like a performance that had lost its rhythm. "You are taking this personally," he said, though his voice carried less certainty than before. Ava did not blink. "No," she replied calmly. "I am taking it accurately." The distinction landed harder than anything raised. Margaret Whitmore shifted slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to show she understood what was happening, even if she was not ready to admit it out loud. "Let us stay focused," she said, her tone controlled, attempting to pull the conversation back into structure. "This is about business, not perception." Ava's gaze moved to her, steady, unwavering. "Business is built on perception," she said. "Who you trust. Who you doubt. Who you think belongs before they ever speak." Silence followed. Not empty. Not neutral. It carried weight now. The kind that made people aware of themselves. Richard Whitmore exhaled slowly, his patience thinning beneath the surface. "We are offering you scale," he said, his voice firm again, trying to anchor the room back into numbers, into logic, into something measurable. $900 million. Expansion into markets you do not currently have access to. That is not something you walk away from lightly. Ava let the number sit between them. 900 million. To them, it was leverage. To her, it was context. She had built companies from less. She had walked away from more. Across the table, the legal advisor who had been flipping through the contract earlier now paused, his brow furrowed deeper, his fingers resting on a clause he had not expected to matter this much. He glanced up briefly, then back down, as if recalculating something in real time. Ava noticed. She always noticed. Daniel leaned forward again, his tone sharpening, frustration edging through the surface. "We are trying to make this work," he said. "But you have to meet us halfway." Ava tilted her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the statement without accepting it. "Halfway implies equal footing," she said. "That is not what you offered." The words were not loud, but they cut through the room with precision. The junior associate looked up again, this time fully, his expression no longer confused but aware, like he was watching a line being drawn that could not be erased. Margaret's fingers pressed together again, her composure holding, but thinner now. "Then what exactly are you suggesting?" she asked. Ava did not answer immediately. She let the question settle, let the room sit with it, let every assumption they had made echo back at them in the silence. Then she leaned forward slightly, just enough to shift the energy back toward her without raising her voice. "I am suggesting," she said slowly, "that you have mistaken access for authority." The words landed with finality. No one spoke. Because for the first time since the meeting began, the number on the table did not feel like power anymore. It felt like something they might lose. The room did not feel balanced anymore. It tilted, subtly but unmistakably, like something foundational had shifted beneath the surface and no one could quite adjust their footing. Ava Jackson sat in complete stillness, her presence no longer blending into the space but defining it, while across from her the Whitmores exchanged the briefest of glances, silent communication passing between them in ways they thought no one else could read. But she read it. She always did. Richard Whitmore leaned forward slowly, his hands pressing flat against the table now, abandoning the comfort of distance. "You are misunderstanding the structure," he said, his voice firmer, more direct, as if clarity could restore control. "This deal positions us as strategic partners, not competitors." Ava's gaze did not shift. "Then why does every clause position you as gatekeepers?" she asked. No hesitation. No softening. Just precision. The question did not linger. It landed. Daniel Whitmore exhaled sharply, his patience now visibly thinning, the edges of frustration no longer hidden behind polished language. "Because we built systems that work," he said. "Systems that protect investments at scale. That is what you are stepping into." Ava tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanged, but something colder moved beneath it now, something more final. "No," she said quietly. "That is what you are trying to keep." The distinction cut deeper this time. Across the table, the legal advisor finally looked up fully, his eyes narrowing as he flipped back 2 pages in the contract, then forward again, as if tracing a thread he had not expected to matter. His pen hovered, then stopped. He did not write anything down. He just looked. The junior associate noticed it too, his posture straightening slightly, attention sharpening as the dynamic in the room shifted from negotiation to something closer to exposure. Margaret Whitmore inhaled slowly, her composure still intact but now visibly strained at the edges, like glass under pressure. "We are offering legitimacy at a level that cannot be replicated," she said, her tone measured, but there was a flicker of urgency beneath it now. Ava's eyes moved to her. "Legitimacy," she repeated, almost softly. The word sat there, heavier than it should have been. Then she leaned forward, just enough to close the distance without raising her voice. "You assume I need yours." Silence followed. "Not the kind that waits. The kind that realizes." Daniel's hand tightened slightly around his pen, the small motion betraying more than his words had. Richard's jaw set, his gaze fixed on Ava now, no longer evaluating, no longer dismissing, but calculating in a different way. Because something was no longer adding up. Not her confidence. Not her restraint. Not the way she had not once tried to defend herself, explain herself, or prove anything. People who needed approval behaved differently. People who needed access spoke differently. Ava did neither. She simply observed. Measured. Waited. Across the table, the legal advisor cleared his throat, the sound quiet but impossible to ignore now. "Richard," he said carefully, his eyes still on the document, "there is a clause here that we should revisit before proceeding further." The words were neutral, but the timing was not. Daniel turned toward him immediately, irritation flashing across his face. "What clause?" he asked. The advisor hesitated for a fraction of a second, then tapped the page lightly. "The termination provision," he said. The room stilled again. Ava did not move. She did not look down. She already knew exactly which clause he meant. And for the first time since the meeting began, the Whitmores were not the only ones asking questions. They were about to realize they had not been the only ones preparing answers. The word termination did not belong in a room like this. Not at this stage. Not this close to final signatures. And yet it sat there now, heavy, undeniable, pulling every ounce of attention toward a single line buried in a document they thought they controlled. Richard Whitmore did not look at Ava. Not yet. His eyes dropped to the page, scanning quickly, then slower, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less threatening if he read them twice. Daniel leaned in immediately, irritation giving way to focus as he followed along, his earlier confidence replaced by something tighter, more alert. That clause has already been reviewed, Daniel said, his voice controlled but edged, as if trying to close the door before it fully opened. The legal advisor did not look up. Reviewed, yes, he said carefully. But not discussed in this context. That word context shifted the air again. Ava remained still, her gaze forward, her expression unchanged, but her silence was no longer passive. It was precise. Across the table, the junior associate leaned slightly closer, his attention fixed now, no longer unsure, no longer hesitant. He understood something was unfolding that no one had planned for. Margaret Whitmore straightened, her composure tightening, her voice measured but firm. Then clarify it, she said. The advisor hesitated for half a second, then spoke. The clause allows for immediate termination of the agreement prior to execution, without penalty, at the discretion of the initiating party. Silence followed. Not confusion. Recognition. Daniel's eyes flicked upward, first to his father, then to Ava, the pieces beginning to align in a way he did not like. That is standard language, he said quickly. It protects both sides. Ava's voice entered the room again, calm, steady, cutting through the tension without rising. Not equally, she said. No one responded immediately. Because now the question was no longer what the clause said. It was who it belonged to. Richard finally looked up, his gaze locking onto Ava with a different kind of focus now, no longer dismissive, no longer casual. Explain, he said. Ava did not reach for the contract. She did not need to. The initiating party, she said, her tone even, deliberate. The one who structured the agreement. The one who defined the terms before you ever saw them. A pause. Just long enough for the realization to begin forming. Daniel's posture stiffened slightly, his jaw tightening as he looked back down at the document, scanning faster now, searching for something he had missed. Margaret's fingers pressed flat against the table again, her eyes narrowing as she followed the same line, the same clause, the same quiet shift in power that had been there all along. Across the table, the legal advisor said nothing more. He did not need to. The words were already doing the work. Ava leaned back slightly in her chair, the movement small but deliberate, her presence filling the silence without effort. You revised sections you thought mattered, she said. Control. Equity. Representation. Her gaze moved from one to the next, steady, unhurried. You never asked who wrote the framework. The room felt different now. Not tense. Not chaotic. Just exposed. Daniel exhaled slowly, his earlier certainty gone, replaced with something sharper, more cautious. You are saying you control the termination, he said. Ava did not answer immediately. She let the question sit. Let it echo. Let them feel the weight of asking it. Then she met his gaze again, her voice quiet, but absolute. I am saying, she said, this deal does not exist without my approval. And for the first time since the meeting began, the Whitmores were not negotiating terms. They were realizing they had never been in control of them. The shift was no longer subtle. It was complete. What had started as a controlled negotiation now felt like a room recalibrating itself in real time, every assumption quietly collapsing under the weight of a truth that had been there from the beginning. Ava Jackson did not move. She did not reach for the contract, did not adjust her posture, did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Across the table, Daniel Whitmore stared at the page in front of him, his eyes scanning the same lines again and again, as if repetition might change what they meant. It did not. Richard Whitmore remained still, but the stillness was different now, no longer composed, no longer strategic. It was contained. Measured. The kind of stillness that comes when control is no longer assumed but questioned. Margaret Whitmore exhaled slowly, her fingers still pressed against the table, her gaze fixed on Ava with a level of focus that had replaced dismissal entirely. Why was this not disclosed directly, she asked, her tone steady but sharpened by something new. Ava met her eyes without hesitation. It was, she said. In the structure. In the language. In the details you chose not to question. The words did not accuse. They revealed. Daniel looked up sharply. We reviewed every section, he said, though his voice carried less certainty now, more defense than confidence. Ava tilted her head slightly. You reviewed what you expected to matter, she replied. Not what actually did. Silence followed, but it was no longer empty. It was heavy with realization. Across the table, the legal advisor finally leaned back slightly, his pen resting motionless in his hand, his role shifting from support to witness. He was no longer guiding the conversation. He was observing its outcome. The junior associate sat still, his earlier discomfort replaced by clarity, his attention fixed on Ava now, not the Whitmores, not the contract, but her. Because for the first time, it was clear who had been leading this room all along. Richard's voice came again, lower this time, more deliberate. You structured this knowing we would not catch it, he said. Ava did not flinch. I structured it knowing you would not look for it, she replied. The distinction landed with precision. Margaret's gaze flickered briefly toward Richard, then back to Ava, the dynamic between them shifting in ways that could not be undone. And if we had? Margaret asked quietly. Ava's expression did not change. Then we would be having a different conversation, she said. Another pause. Longer this time. Because now the question was no longer about the deal. It was about position. Daniel leaned back slowly, the movement lacking its earlier confidence, his posture reflecting something closer to recalculation. So where does that leave us? He asked. Ava did not answer immediately. She let the question sit, let it settle into the room, let every person at that table feel the weight of it before she responded. Then she leaned forward slightly, her hands resting lightly against the table, her voice calm but unmistakably final. It leaves you, she said, in a position you did not plan for. The words did not rise. They did not need to. They carried their own authority. Outside, the light had shifted again, the sun lower now, casting longer shadows across the glass walls, stretching reflections across the table like lines being redrawn. Inside, no one reached for a pen. No one turned a page. Because for the first time since the meeting began, the outcome was no longer something they controlled. It was something they were waiting to hear. For a moment, no one spoke. Not because they did not have anything to say, but because every option now felt smaller than it had just minutes ago. Ava Jackson sat perfectly still, her presence anchoring the room in a way that could not be ignored anymore. Across the table, Daniel Whitmore leaned back slowly, his earlier confidence now replaced with calculation, his eyes no longer scanning the contract but studying her. Really studying her. As if trying to understand how he had misread the situation so completely. Richard Whitmore remained forward, his hand still pressed against the table, but the pressure had shifted. It was no longer about control. It was about containment. You set this up, he said finally, his voice low, measured, but stripped of its earlier certainty. Ava did not respond immediately. She let the words exist on their own, without interruption, without correction. Then she spoke, her tone calm, even. I prepared for this, she said. The difference mattered. Across the table, Margaret Whitmore exhaled slowly, her composure still intact but no longer untouched. Prepared for what? She asked. Ava's eyes moved to her, steady, unwavering. For you to decide who I was before understanding what I built, she said. The room stilled again, but this time it was not tension. It was recognition. Daniel shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening slightly. "This is not about that," he said quickly. Ava did not look at him. "It is exactly about that," she replied. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. It cut clean, precise, leaving no space for interpretation. Across the table, the legal advisor lowered his gaze again, but not to review. To avoid. Because now, the conversation had moved beyond clauses and contracts. It had reached something harder to rewrite. Ava leaned back slightly in her chair, her posture relaxed, but her presence sharper than ever. For a brief moment, her gaze drifted toward the glass wall, toward the skyline beyond it, the city moving without pause, indifferent to what was unfolding inside this room. And in that stillness, something shifted inward. Not hesitation. Memory. At 26, she had sat in a smaller room, across a smaller table, listening to a man explain why her numbers were not enough. Not because they were wrong, but because they did not come from the right place. At 32, she had been asked who backed her, as if success required validation from someone else to be real. And now, years later, the scale had changed, the stakes had grown, but the pattern had not. Ava's gaze returned to the table, to the faces in front of her, to the room that had tried to define her before she spoke. But she was not 26 anymore. She was not 32. She did not need approval. She did not need access. She did not need to convince anyone of anything. Daniel broke the silence again, his voice sharper now, but underneath it was something else. Urgency. "So what are you saying?" he asked. Ava looked at him, calm, steady, final. "I am saying," she said, "you built this entire conversation on an assumption." A pause. Long enough for the weight to settle. Then she continued. "And now you are realizing it was the wrong one." The room did not respond. Because there was nothing left to argue. Only something left to accept. And none of them were ready for what came next. The room had reached a point where silence was no longer neutral. It was heavy, deliberate, pressing against every person at the table with a quiet demand for resolution. Ava Jackson did not rush to fill it. She allowed it to exist, to stretch, to force clarity where assumptions had once lived. Across from her, Daniel Whitmore shifted again, but this time there was no attempt to disguise it. The confidence that had carried him through the beginning of the meeting was gone, replaced by something sharper, more uncertain. "Then say it clearly," he said, his voice firm but edged with urgency. "What exactly are you doing here?" Ava's gaze met his without hesitation. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached slowly for the folder in front of her, her movements calm, controlled, intentional. The sound of the paper sliding against the table seemed louder than it should have been. Every eye followed it. She opened it without looking down, her focus never leaving the people across from her. "You assumed I was here to secure your approval," she said. Her voice was steady, almost quiet, but it carried through the room with precision. Richard Whitmore's jaw tightened slightly, his eyes narrowing as he watched her, no longer dismissive, no longer confident, but fully alert now. Ava continued, her tone unchanged. "You assumed access to your network was leverage." She slid a single document forward across the table, stopping it just within reach but not offering it. "You assumed this deal needed you." The words did not rise. They did not need to. Daniel leaned forward instinctively, his hand hovering over the paper before finally picking it up. His eyes moved quickly across the page, then slowed, then stopped. Something in his expression shifted. Not confusion. Recognition. "What is this?" he asked, though the answer was already forming. Ava did not look at the document. She did not need to. "The full structure," she said. "The version you never asked to see." Margaret Whitmore leaned in slightly, her composure still intact but thinner now, her attention fixed on the page Daniel held. "That is not possible," she said quietly. Ava's gaze moved to her. It is, she replied. Across the table, the legal advisor stood still, his eyes locked onto the document, his earlier hesitation now replaced with something closer to certainty. He understood. He had seen enough. Daniel's grip on the paper tightened slightly as he flipped to the next page, then the next, his movements faster now, less controlled. This shows controlling interest, he said, his voice lower, more focused. Ava nodded once. Not confirmation. Acknowledgement. Richard leaned forward further, his composure tightening into something more direct, more urgent. You positioned yourself as the majority holder, he said. Ava met his gaze. I am the majority holder, she replied. The distinction landed hard. No one spoke. Because now the numbers were no longer theoretical. They were real. Measurable. Undeniable. Ava rested her hands lightly on the table again, her posture unchanged. Her presence steady. You were not evaluating me, she said. You were being evaluated. The word settled into the room with finality. Across the table, Daniel slowly lowered the document, his earlier certainty gone completely now, replaced by something he could not mask. Margaret said nothing. Richard did not interrupt. Because for the first time since the meeting began, the power in the room was no longer shifting. It had already shifted. And they were only just realizing where it had landed. No one moved. Not immediately. The weight of what had just been revealed settled into the room like something permanent, something that could not be undone or reinterpreted. Ava Jackson remained exactly where she was, composed, steady, untouched by the shift that had just dismantled everything the Whitmores thought they controlled. Across the table, Daniel Whitmore stared at the document in his hands, but he was no longer reading it. He was absorbing it, recalculating everything that had led to this moment, every assumption, every word, every decision that now felt misplaced. Richard Whitmore leaned back slowly, the movement measured, deliberate, but the authority that once defined it was gone, replaced by something quieter, more restrained. You withheld this, he said, his voice low, controlled, but stripped of certainty. Ava did not react. I presented exactly what was necessary, she replied. The distinction was precise. Margaret Whitmore exhaled slowly, her fingers finally lifting from the table as if releasing something she had been holding onto for too long. This changes the structure entirely, she said. Ava met her gaze. No, she said calmly. It reveals it. Silence followed. Not confusion. Not tension. Just clarity. Across the table, the legal advisor closed his folder slowly, the sound soft but final, his role no longer active in shaping the deal but witnessing its outcome. Daniel finally set the document down, his movement slower now, more deliberate, as if trying to regain control over something that no longer responded to him. If this is accurate, he said, his voice steady but careful, then you have been in control of this negotiation from the beginning. Ava did not hesitate. Yes, she said. No emphasis. No hesitation. Just truth. The word settled into the room with finality. Richard's gaze hardened slightly, not with anger, but with recognition. Then why come here at all, he asked. Ava leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed, her presence unchanged, but her voice carried something sharper now, something unmistakably final. Because I wanted to see how you would handle power you thought you had, she said. The words landed without resistance. Margaret looked down briefly, then back up, her composure intact but no longer untouched. And now that you have, she asked. Ava held her gaze. Now I know, she said. The room did not respond. Because there was nothing left to challenge. The evaluation was complete. Across the table, Daniel's earlier confidence had fully dissolved, replaced by something quieter, more aware. He did not argue. He did not interrupt. He simply sat there, understanding that the position he thought he held had never existed. Ava placed her hands lightly on the table once more, her fingers still, her presence absolute. You questioned my position, she said, her voice calm but unyielding. You questioned my capability. You questioned whether I belonged in this room. She paused, just long enough for the weight of those words to settle. But you never questioned the one thing that mattered. No one spoke. No one needed to ask. Ava's gaze moved across each of them, steady, certain. Who was actually in control? The silence that followed was not empty. It was complete. Because for the first time since the meeting began, there was nothing left to negotiate. Only something left to accept. The room did not resist anymore. It did not argue. It did not push back. It simply absorbed the reality that had been laid out in front of it, quiet and undeniable. Ava Jackson remained seated for one final moment, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, as if giving them time not to respond, but to understand. Across the table, Daniel Whitmore's eyes dropped to the contract again, but this time there was no urgency, no attempt to reinterpret what he was seeing. The numbers had not changed. The structure had not shifted. Only his understanding of it had. Richard Whitmore sat still, his hands now resting loosely against the table, the tension that once defined his posture replaced by something more controlled, more contained. Margaret Whitmore did not speak. She did not look away either. She simply watched Ava, fully aware now that the dynamic had never been what they believed it was. Ava reached forward slowly and closed the folder in front of her, the soft sound of paper meeting paper carrying through the silence like a final marker. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. Every movement was measured, deliberate, final. Then she stood. The motion was smooth, effortless, but it shifted the room instantly. Not because it was dramatic. Because it signaled conclusion. Across the table, no one stood with her. No one interrupted. Because they understood. This was not a pause. This was an ending. Ava looked at them one last time, her expression calm, her voice steady, but carrying something unmistakably final. You built your position on assumption, she said. On appearance. On what you thought I represented before you ever asked what I controlled. The words did not accuse. They concluded. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing. Richard did not respond. Margaret remained still. Ava continued, her tone unchanged. You questioned whether I belonged in this room, she said. But you never questioned whether this room belonged to me. The silence that followed was complete. No movement. No sound. Just the weight of realization settling into place. Ava reached for the document Daniel had set down and slid it back toward herself, not abruptly, not forcefully, just enough to make the action clear. Ownership. Decision. Finality. Then she spoke the words that ended everything. The deal is cancelled. No emphasis. No hesitation. Just fact. The $900 million they had walked into the room expecting to control disappeared in a single sentence. No negotiation. No reconsideration. No second chance. Across the table, the legal advisor closed his folder fully now, his role finished. The junior associate sat motionless, witnessing something he would not forget. Daniel exhaled slowly, but did not argue. Richard's gaze lowered, not in defeat, but in recognition. Margaret's composure held, but her silence said everything. Ava turned without waiting for a response. She did not look back. She did not need to. Her steps were quiet against the floor as she walked toward the glass doors, the city beyond still moving, still alive, unchanged by what had just happened inside. But the room behind her was different now. Not loud. Not chaotic. Just still. Because in less than an hour, everything they thought they controlled had been taken from them without a single raised voice. And Ava Jackson had never once needed to prove who she was. She only needed to let them reveal who they were. The door closed behind Ava Jackson with a soft click that barely echoed, but inside the room it sounded louder than anything that had been said in the last hour. No one moved to follow her. No one called her name. The space she left behind did not feel empty. It felt exposed. Across the table, the contract still lay open, pages slightly shifted, the ink unchanged but the meaning completely transformed. $900 million had not just disappeared. It had been withdrawn with precision, without hesitation, without negotiation. Daniel Whitmore remained seated, his eyes fixed on the spot where she had been sitting, his posture still but no longer composed. He was not thinking about the numbers anymore. He was replaying every moment. Every word. Every assumption. Richard Whitmore leaned back slowly, his gaze lowering to the table, his fingers resting loosely against the surface as if the weight he had been holding had finally slipped beyond his reach. For the first time, there was no immediate strategy, no correction, no next move forming behind his expression. Only silence. Margaret Whitmore sat upright, her composure intact but altered, her eyes still on the door Ava had walked through, as if understanding had arrived too late to change anything. Across from them, the legal advisor gathered his papers carefully, not rushed, not hesitant, but with the quiet finality of someone who knew there was nothing left to negotiate. The junior associate remained still, his pen untouched, his notebook open, witnessing a moment that had shifted from instruction to realization. Because what had happened in that room was not just a lost deal. It was a lesson that could not be rewritten. Daniel finally spoke, but his voice was lower now, stripped of the confidence that had filled it before. "We misread her," he said. It was not a question. It was not an excuse. It was acknowledgement. Richard did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice was quieter than anyone in that room had ever heard it. "No," he said. "We dismissed her." The correction mattered. It always did. Margaret exhaled slowly, her gaze steady now, no longer fixed on the door but on the table in front of her, on the contract that had once represented control. "And we paid for it," she said. No one disagreed. Because the cost was not just financial. It was structural, reputational, internal. The kind of loss that does not show up on a balance sheet but reshapes everything that comes after. Outside the glass walls, the city continued without pause, traffic moving, people crossing streets, deals being made in rooms just like this one, unaware that inside this space, something fundamental had just shifted. Ava Jackson did not slow down as she walked through the hallway, her steps steady, her expression unchanged. She did not check her phone. She did not look back. She did not need to. The outcome had never depended on their reaction. It had already been decided the moment they chose to see her as less than what she was. As she reached the elevator, the doors opened without delay, the quiet hum of movement replacing the silence she had left behind. And for the first time that day, there was no tension, no pressure, no performance. Just clarity. Because power, real power, had never been about being recognized in the room. It had always been about owning the outcome when the room failed to recognize you at all.